Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good day, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar hosted by socialprotection.org together with the Malawian government. This webinar is being conducted in the context of an ongoing midterm review of the Malawi National Social Support Program, Phase 2, which runs from 2018 to 2023. And in that context, two webinars have been organized. The first, which was on grievance and redress mechanisms, which was hosted just before the Christmas break, and now the second webinar. So the topic for today is on using social registries to develop effective tools for household targeting. And we have with us a number of panelists who will talk us through a number of issues. On this occasion, we've decided to structure the webinar as a panel discussion. We have three topics that we will look at for some 15 or 20 minutes with interventions from each of the panelists. And of course, there's an opportunity for you as the audience to join in, albeit remotely. There is, as for those of you who are familiar with these webinars, there is a Q&A box. And there we would and if you look at the bottom of your screens on the right side, you should find the Q&A box. You are invited to lodge questions whenever throughout the event. If you do so, please keep your questions simple, straightforward, so that they can be easily communicated to the panelists. And please also state your name, your organization, and the country from where you're speaking. We don't have a lot of time, and we'll do our best. We have a Q&A session provision to answer some of the questions received towards the end, but we probably only have about 15 or 20 minutes, which isn't a lot of time, but we'll do our utmost to get back to you one way or another. Just to mention that we understand that there were 300 people who registered for this event. We don't know how many will actually join, but it sounds like a lot, and we're very happy to see that, but it might also mean that we get lots of questions, and we'll have to see how we get through that. So at this point, what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce the members of the panel, and we have, as you can see in front of you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 persons. We have Patricia Zimpita, who's the director in the Division of Poverty Reduction and Social Protection within the Ministry of Economic Planning and Development. And then we have Mr. Dalitso Kalimba, who is the deputy director in the same division of the ministry. We then have, if we can just move the screen so I can see the names of the panelists, please. Could we just scroll down? Then we have Sabine Cerceau, who has been working with GIZ in Cambodia, currently in Germany. She's been working on the social registry with the government of Cambodia. And then we have Ms. Valentina Barca, who's an independent social protection expert who has done a lot of work on social registries in many different parts of the world, and therefore is able to offer also a kind of global perspective of good practices. And I think we then have, last but not least, Mr. Krishna Ramesh, who works for an organization called ID Insight in Zambia, and has done a lot of work on MIS systems, on social registries, as well as evaluative work, and has done a lot of work both in Zambia, but also in Malawi with the current Unified Beneficiary Registry, the social registry that we have in Malawi. And myself, my name's Tony Land. I'm actually the team leader for the midterm review, and I'm also the moderator for this session. So you're all very welcome. And what I'd like to do now is to invite Patricia Zimpita just to give us some opening remarks on behalf of the government of Malawi. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. Let me once again welcome every one of you to this webinar on using social registries to develop effective tools for household targeting. As Tony has already indicated, this is a second webinar that we are holding within our series of reviewing the Malawi National Social Support Program. This is a 5-year program that is running from 2018 up to 2023. And recognizing the fact that there's a vast pool of resources in terms of experiences on the ground in the area of social registries, we thought that it would be good to tap into that vast pool of resources and see what kind of lessons we can learn from each other in terms of how each one of you have used social registries for targeting social protection programs. I think you will agree with me that targeting for social protection programs can be a sensitive issue because everyone wants to be targeted, but once you are confident that the method of targeting you are using is objective enough for people to see it, the work becomes easier. So the webinar today aims at exchanging experiences as well as learning from each other in terms of the kind of experiences that each of us have on the use of social registries. Apart from just looking at targeting, we are also looking at experiences in terms of issues of data collection. There are issues to do with the cost in terms of managing and maintaining social registries. We are also looking at issues of updating the social registries, which I believe most of you also have got some experiences on that. Therefore, at the end of the day, what we want to see is to ensure that the social registries that we have in place are both relevant as well as credible and serve the needs of program implementers. And in this case, we are not only looking at social protection in the case of Malawi, but we are saying these registries should serve other purposes as well, other social programs, not just social protection. We have had those experiences in our case. Therefore, it remains for me to thank each one of you for taking your time to join in this webinar. This is a learning and exchange webinar, and I therefore want to invite each one of you, as well as the participants from all over the world, to join in and be part of this learning and discussion process on using social registries. I therefore want to wish each one of you fruitful discussions. Thank you, and over to you, Tony, for the rest of the program.
Thank you very much indeed, Patricia, for welcoming us. And without further ado, I think we can move on with our program. And as I mentioned, we've got 3 kind of subtopics we'd like to look at. The first one really is the question, keeping social registries up to date. How to address the challenges involved in updating information so that registries remain relevant and credible. It's a straightforward question, but we know it's something for which the answers aren't necessarily as straightforward, and it's a perennial issue challenging countries, both developed, developing, however we wish to call them, but we know that it is an ongoing issue. So what I'd like to do now is to invite our panelists to speak to this issue, and I'd like to begin by inviting Ms. Sabine Cerceau from GIZ, and apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name quite right, but I hope I've got it just about correct. If you could give us some insights from some of the work you've been doing in Cambodia, particular on what I understand is called the on-demand data registration system. Over to you. If you could just maybe in 5 minutes give us a sense of an overview, and then we'll see how others can join the conversation. So over to you, Sabine.
Thanks, Tony. Yes. Hi, I'm Sabine Cerceau. I'm a social protection advisor working with GIZ. And for almost the past 15 years, I've been working in different countries where GIZ is active, developing and supporting the implementation of social protection systems. And for the last 5 years, I've been in Cambodia as advisor and team leader, advising the ID Poor program, Cambodia's national targeting system. And I think there are a lot of similarities with the UBR. So I think that's a very exciting opportunity to share some of the experiences we have been making in Cambodia, and to see how this could be of help for Malawi. Maybe to start with, let me give a little bit of background information on the ID Poor system, because not everyone might be familiar with it. So ID Poor has been introduced in 2005 by the Ministry of Planning. It's the National Registry to identify poor and vulnerable households. There has been support from GIZ and the German and Australian government since the beginning. Similar to Malawi, it's a combination of a proxy means testing and a community-based targeting approach. It currently covers all rural and urban areas of the country. Around 20% of the population is currently identified as eligible and categorized as either very poor or moderately poor. That is around a bit more than 3 million individuals. So until 2017, it was a round-based concept. So registration was carried out every 3 years, which is, compared to other countries, reasonably well timed. Usually, if you have the census-like approach, you would have a registration every 5 to 8 years. Sometimes it's even longer. So I think 3 years is already a good period. But still, as we all know, poverty is dynamic. People move in and out of poverty, and over time, the risks of inclusion and exclusion errors will obviously increase as new people will fall into poverty. Others will be left out for other reasons from the usual registration rounds. There are migrants, which was really an issue in Cambodia, and one of the reasons which motivated the government in 2017 to say, let's try out an on-demand registration approach. So we started in 2017 with support from GIZ to pilot this approach, which was initially really thought of being an additional mechanism to reflect changes within the household status within this 3 years update cycle. So we did this 1 year pilot in 2018, and it was quite successful, and the government decided that it should be rolled out nationwide over a period of 3 years. So then there was COVID, and COVID really acted as an accelerator in our case, because ID Poor was the mechanism which allowed to identify households and individuals who were affected by the economic consequences of the pandemic, and in order to target the emergency cash transfer of the government of Cambodia. So it was decided that we do not have 3 years to roll it out, but rather 3 weeks. It was a bit more than 3 weeks in May 2020. And it was really a tremendous effort. And I have to say, I was deeply impressed how well it worked. Everyone worked really well together to make it happen and to really roll it out within a couple of weeks. And there have been, in the first weeks, 50,000 households have been added in addition to the ID Poor database. And over the first couple of months, it was even 200,000 households. So that really shows how important it is to have this kind of on-demand mechanisms where you can reflect these changes. And then, as it was so successful, the government even decided that the initial plan to have it as an additional mechanism was changed, and now since the beginning of this year, we only have on-demand as the registration approach applied in Cambodia. So there's no round cycle concept anymore. So now the question was, what was a bit the critical preconditions and the success factors why it worked well in Cambodia? And first of all, I have to say, ID Poor is very well anchored in the Cambodian system, both in law and in practice. It's well trusted. It has been implemented for a long time already now. The government has a great sense of ownership and also commitment when it comes to implementing ID Poor. There's a very regular communication between the Ministry of Planning and data users in order to make sure that the data is relevant and aligned with the needs of the data user programs. So this was already very important. But then I think an on-demand system, first of all, it needs the local administrative capacities because you need some sort of citizen interface. And this is a struggle for many countries where you do not have such local structures and capacities in place. And here Cambodia was pretty lucky because they could implement this mechanism via the commune councils, who were already involved before in the IDPO mechanism. So they knew, they were already familiar with the procedures, and they were also involved in the enrollment to social assistance schemes. How this will work out in the future needs to be seen. There is always a risk that this might be an overburdening of the local structures. Ask me in 1 year, then I could maybe tell you more, but we are aware that this is a risk.
Okay,
then
thank you. So
another.
if you could just quickly sort of wrap up, because I'm sure there'll be, of course, this will spurn lots and lots of questions, but we just to give
I'm getting excited because I think it's a really interesting
I can see the enthusiasm.
So to keep it short, I think one more success factor was the use of digital technologies. We have a very good front and back end technical solutions in place. Invested a lot in here. You should always keep in mind that the most advanced technical solution is not necessarily the best. So we really took this into consideration. And then maybe just to sum it up, also what were some of the trade-offs we had to do if you switch from this census approach to an on-demand approach. First of all, you lose some of the participatory elements we had before because the communes are on a local level, but not as close as the village level. So we lost this consultation process in the identification. And then overall, I think social registries using this on-demand registration tend to have a lower coverage than the census survey systems, especially when it comes to the uptake of vulnerable and marginalized populations. We see that there's a lack of information, there's lack of resources maybe to apply, there's stigma, there's time involved to go to the commune council and apply. So this is a risk, and we're trying to mitigate it via intensifying communication outreach, having a very good and solid complaint management system in place. I think you have been also talking about this in the last webinar already, and also adapting the implementation procedures accordingly. I'll stop it here.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for that introduction, which obviously, as I say, it sounds very fascinating and raises many questions. But it makes me ask the first question is, does this sound like something that would be applicable or could address some of the challenges that are currently being faced in Malawi? So I'd just like to turn to invite Mr. Dalitso Kalimba from the Poverty Reduction and Social Protection Division, maybe to give us a sense of some of the challenges that they are facing in maintaining the UBR up to date. What are some of the practical challenges, and whether you think this online on-demand approach might provide part of the solution? Mr. Dalitso, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, and thanks, Sabine, for your for the contribution. I think there's a lot to learn from your experience. Let me first indicate that for the Malawi Social Registry, it was developed in 2016, and what we had in mind at that time is supporting targeting for the two main programs, the two consumption support programs, which are the social rights transfer and the public works. And for those programs, a recertification of households would happen after every 4 years. So that's why you find that in terms of the census type of data collection for the UBR, it's set at an interval of 4 years. However, let me indicate that after that, I think there was a lot of demand for other programs to also benefit from UBR within social protection, as well as beyond social protection, agriculture, etc. And then there was the issue of shocks. We noted that previously we used to have what we call the lean season happening maybe once in a year, but beyond the lean season, there are other shocks that are coming in more frequently and requiring data for targeting of participants to beneficiaries to participate in the programs. So we recognize the need for more regularly updated data data which is up to date within the UBR. So the option of data on demand, which Sabine has presented, is one of the options we are looking at. Mm-hmm. We have challenges, especially with there are two factors. First of all, the demographic data within the UBR changes so frequently. We have a number of births, households splitting, households merging through marriages, etc. And there is indeed need for more regular updating. In addition to that, where poverty is concerned, because we are using a proxy means test as part of the UBR for wealth classification of households, we have noted that the poverty among the poorest changes quite a lot. You could be better off today and tomorrow much poorer just because of a minor shock that hits you. So basically, the poverty classification that we have can be reshuffled at any point in time, hence the need for more regular updating of the data. In terms of what we are specifically doing is we are still exploring. There's so many options that are there. We have done some mapping, a study on mapping of what is being done in other countries. So that has given us the number of options that are there, so many of them. Now, based on that mapping, we are now coming up with a more contextualized study to address our specific needs as a country. And that's something that is still ongoing. Just to give examples of some of the options that we're looking at, one of them is integrating the social registry with other management information systems, databases, so that it benefits from the updates that happens in the programs. The programs, some of them have got GRM, grievance redress mechanisms, and we find an opportunity for getting updates from those programs once they are linked with the UBR. We also thinking of integrating with the National Registration Information System, our civil registry, which provides data in terms of births, deaths, etc. And that process has already started. But I think those are just examples. But the point is that we are still undertaking, trying to understand more and come up with very feasible contextualized solutions for Malawi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dalitso, for that overview, and to know that there are quite a number of different options that are being explored. And as you mentioned, to take account not just of the core programs, but also the linkages to the shock responsiveness, which we will be discussing later, as well as other social support programs. Turning to you, Krishna, I know you've been doing quite a lot of work, maybe some of the more back office work in terms of the technical systems, the design, to make these things happen. And we heard from Sabine that she said, you know, the most sophisticated technology isn't always the best. And she also mentioned a number of preconditions that need to be in place. From your experiences, maybe from working in Malawi and Zambia and maybe elsewhere, would you like to sort of highlight some of the sort of experiences that you've had, both positive, but also some of the challenges in this area of trying to keep systems up to date and flexible?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Tony, and hello to everyone. Start with, definitely agree with Sabine. Simple is often most effective and most efficient when it comes to a lot of the back-end data systems that we look at. So for a little bit of context, as ID Insight, a lot of our focus is on mobilizing data and evidence in order to inform decision-making, and that's included working closely with my fellow panelists, Dalitso and Malawi, as well as in other contexts with regards to social registries, data systems, and just sort of how can we most effectively put this information together in a way that can be used for targeting decisions, resource allocation decisions, and everything along those lines. So I think specifically I'll talk about two things that we found to be really important in sort of laying that foundation, in setting those pipes that will sort of facilitate decision making. I think the first one is around just data quality fundamentally. When we talk about sort of updating and when we talk about the need for that, I think there's a really important element of when that information is first collected, the better the quality is, the more sort of rigorously we put in place measures, the less that there's obviously other reasons that information will need to be updated, but the less we sort of, the better of a start we begin with. And so on that front, I think we focused a lot on setting up systems to collect high quality data the first time around, and then also sort of identifying the leanest possible ways to keep that data updated, some of which have already been mentioned. I think one area that we've particularly focused on is just setting. Registries are big. Registries have a lot of information, and as they're continually being updated, and so sort of setting the systems in place to ensure that you're mitigating a lot of headaches during both the data collection process, but then also during the data processing elements is something that we focused a lot on. And so that includes aspects such as just integrating data quality checks more effectively and automating those checks as well is something that we found to be really essential in the entire sort of in the data ecosystem, so to speak, as well as institutionalizing methodologies through which individuals or entities can go back and verify the information that they have to ensure that the groundwork is set up most effectively in terms of what those original sort of data sets look like, and then therefore knowing where and how that needs to be updated. I think another part of that we've looked at a lot is just standardization. There's a lot of entities when we're looking at these sort of social registries that are looking to use this information in different ways. And so a lot of what ID Insights also worked on and working on is sort of just thinking about what are ways in which we can, in a much more standardized way, put together sort of a data quality assessment methodology and index to ensure that we're sort of institutionalizing those key processes that are necessary, both when information is being collected, but then also sort of in the follow-up of that, so for it to be as useful as possible. I think the second part I'll talk about is with regards to updating. And obviously, there is going to be always an element of going out, collecting information when it comes to updating. And I think an important principle we focused on there is just shortening those feedback loops as much as possible and sort of making this as cost effective as possible. So we've talked about on-demand methods. Sabine mentioned a lot about those, which I think is naturally an important component of this. Dalitso also mentioned the importance of sort of integration and interoperability. And that's something that's been very prominent in our eyes when we sort of have the benefit of centralized national ID systems. Integrating the registry with other sources of information is something that's a very powerful way of ensuring that information only needs to be obtained once and these elements can speak to each other. There's a challenge in it because a lot of these systems have been developed independently. There is an element of sort of upfront investment that needs to go into the interoperability side of things. However, once that is made, it can prove a very efficient way to sort of just have these data sets talk to each other, to put it very bluntly. And interoperability, not just between different sort of sources of information within government, but also with regards to a lot of cooperating partners too. When we're looking at crisis response, when we're looking at COVID-19 is a great example, there's usually a lot of cooperating partners that are also sort of operating within the space and implementing programs. And to the extent that there's interoperability of information that can allow them to sort of inform decision-making on their own programs using the data that is within the social registry. That's something that we found to be a sort of very efficient value add. The last piece I'll talk about on this is the importance of a variety of sort of diversifying your methodologies for collecting information. I think one of the important things we saw during COVID is obviously doing things in person became a lot more challenging. And so setting up systems and setting up structures for how we're going to collect data remotely, what are the opportunities to sort of use aspects, methods like phone surveys, like remote data collection methods to combine some of this information or to obtain some of this information and complement the other data sources that we have, sort of hedging your bets in a sense in terms of where you're going to get data while also ensuring that you have that foundational data quality. I think that's something that we've seen to really be a key principle. I think naturally important prerequisites around ensuring that sort of there's sufficient mobile phone penetration within your country, et cetera, et cetera. However, again, it's a case of using a variety of different methods with a baseline expectation for what you want sort of data quality to look like and sort of what that information is going to be when it comes in. Because I think something that we've seen to be really important in terms of just making the process lean and as cost effective as possible, as opposed to repeating processes that may already be done or sort of recollecting information that may exist in other places or in other forms. So I'll pause there with regards to this question.
Thanks, Krishna. I think you've already touched on a number of issues that maybe you can elaborate on our other subtopics, but I'll take away particularly this notion of a lean system, which I think also conjures up the idea of things that are efficient, simple, efficient, rigorous, and obviously effective. So thanks very much. I mean, there's a lot there that I saw people, I could just see writing notes, and I'm sure our audience as well. There's a lot to pick up from your intervention. But I'd like to now turn over to Valentina to try to sort of wrap this all up, and maybe also from what she's heard now, but also picking up on some of her other experiences working in a number of other countries, parts of the world. So Valentina, maybe it's all been said, but maybe there's some more to say.
Yeah, my feeling is it has all been said. I think my fellow panelists have touched on all the key points, but let me just bring it together very quickly. Just first of all, let's remember this is not just about social registries. It's about any information system that's bringing in data that's being used for targeting, even if it's a program-specific MIS. It's the same considerations. What we're talking about is guaranteeing that anyone who needs assistance can access it at any time. And it's that kind of inclusiveness and meeting those changing needs. It's not just about poverty targeting. My panelists have mentioned kind of the continuous dynamics of poverty. It's also about categorically targeted programs. You may have newcomers, new children, as Dalitso was mentioning, being born, families breaking up, migrants moving in, as Sabine was saying. There's other life cycle risks that are sort of coming in, people, kind of disability, chronic illness, death of a breadwinner, etc. And obviously crises and shocks, and you've been touching on that too. And in fact, let me just make a point here that on-demand approaches to registration are intrinsically shock responsive. In fact, countries that already did have shock response kind of on-demand systems were able to dynamically respond to the shock. A lot of the ex-Soviet countries, we saw surges in applications from 10 to 50% surge in applications, just automatically kind of responding to those changing needs. And a lot of countries during the COVID-19 response obviously created new on-demand systems for people to be applying, many of these using remote registration approaches, as Krishna was mentioning. So I think the point that Dalitso made is crucial here in terms of, so what should countries do? I think as Malawi has been doing, what's really important here is to be aware of what approaches are out there, kind of what are those different options for kind of making the intake process, that registration process, more dynamic, and understanding that for each of these, there's strengths and there's weaknesses and there's preconditions. So thinking through for your country context, what are the strengths for you? What are the weaknesses for you? What are the preconditions? Where are those met? How can you be leveraging the capacities you already have in countries, the ecosystem, the data ecosystem you already have in country? How can you be linking to that? And starting from there. So I really appreciated kind of how Dalitso set that out. And what are those key approaches? You've been discussing them. It's about going beyond the static census surveys. Very often we have intention to do those every 2 to 3 years. Maybe it might even be written in legislation. We will do them every 2 to 3 years, and then the cost is high, there isn't the political will, the delay is often quite significant. So it's about shifting towards these more continuous approaches, which are either on demand, in person through permanent local offices or capacity. And this doesn't have to be social welfare offices. It can also be well-crafted agreement and training with municipal offices and kind of other structures, as Sabine has been discussing, and Brazil and other countries have been experimenting with these approaches of leveraging whatever capacity is there at local level of administration. It's about exploring the great potential of digital windows, obviously acknowledging all of the limitations that having digital intake can bring, but during the COVID pandemic, we've seen that some of those can be overcome. And I can say that in research before the pandemic, these had hardly ever been used for registration for social protection, but a lot of countries are shifting to using these. I know South Africa, for example, is now deciding that they will allow intake through digital applications, not just through the SASA offices. It's about thinking through methods such as the integration with existing government databases. Several of you mentioned the importance of civil registration and vital statistics, how the integration with that data set can be crucial to bring in information on newborns, for example, but also deaths. And even kind of more simple methods of periodic active outreach. Kind of several countries have set up these roving teams that go and target especially communities that are maybe where levels of vulnerability are very high, where maybe the data is showing us that applications have been very low, and actively targeting those communities with kind of buses with people kind of going to those communities with roving desks and collecting data there. So there's a lot of that can be done, a lot that can be played around with, and the COVID-19 crisis has really shown us that where there is a will, there is a way in terms of making some of these methods work over.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I think that helps to round this up. And I guess one of the takeaways is that, in fact, there are a multitude of ways of approaching these challenges. Clearly, I think you've underscored the issue of trying to move away, to use such options to move away from a static type of approach to something that's continuous, that is, say, on demand, that enables a much more flexible adaptation to the realities. But underpinning all of that, obviously, you need fairly robust systems, because now you're having data coming in perhaps from different sources, and somehow it needs to land, it needs to be credible, robust, verifiable, and trusted in the end of the day, so that people feel that this is objective information that is being collected in a way that's given everyone an opportunity to have access. So I think also what came up is that many of the issues we want to discuss in the next topics have already been flagged. So let's move on to that next topic. And really that second topic is about how social registries can support categorical targeting, where one recognizes that rather than exclusive focus on poverty, one is also looking at, as you mentioned, Valentina, on the various vulnerabilities and challenges that can obtain throughout one's the life cycle, and how categorical targeting may offer a better or more effective approach to tracking and identifying needs. What are the implications for the social registry, particularly when you've set things up, perhaps first of all, around a more static census sweep, but now you're moving towards, again, this more, let's say, nuanced and subtle approach? I think in a way we've touched on those topics already, but what I'd like to do now is go back to Malawi, go back to Mr. Kalimba, just to perhaps flag, just to sort of set the scene a little bit, just tell us maybe what the thinking is in Malawi about what might be the benefits of categorical approach, adopting a categorical approach. Where's the thinking at the moment, and what might that mean for adapting the way in which the UBR operates? So Dalitso, if you'd just like to throw in a few points then to kick off the conversation, and then we'll move on to the other panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. I think Malawi, indeed, we have an ongoing discussion. There are thoughts to introduce categorical targeting for one of our main programs, the Social Cash Transfer Program. As you might be aware, the Social Cash has poverty targeting, but also has some categorical aspects in it. So you still apply the poverty thresholds to make sure that you're getting the poorest. But then on top of that, you apply a constraint with regard to some of the categorical parameters like labor constraint, elderly, disabilities, etc. So it's a more or less like a combined approach, but I think poverty is more important in that. Now, we have had this discussion in view of our experiences with regard to use of poverty for targeting over the past years. I think we have had some challenges in terms of the actual implementation. I think we understand that there could be advantages and the disadvantages for migrating to categorical. But I think one of the issues that is already coming out is that it might be administratively more convenient. What the situation we have on the ground is that the households sometimes tend to dispute the classification or the wealth classification. And it's understandable because when you look at the poverty levels in our rural areas, there's very little difference between a household which will categorize as extremely poor to a household which is moderate to poor. In terms of the figures, you might have a difference, but when you look at the household, there isn't much to appreciate. So that has created a bit of a challenge in terms of them buying into the results coming out of the classification. Whereas the categorical appears to be more straightforward. You are a male or female, nobody disputes. You are elderly, we have national IDs, which tell us that. Then we have people with disabilities, and then we have other categories. I think in the manner we want to, because it's an ongoing discussion, to migrate to categorical. If we do, I don't think we'll have very serious challenges with the way our civil registry is structured. I think the main issue is ensuring that it's always up to date, regularly updated. I think most of the categories, if you look at the programs that are targeting frequently changing categories like women that are lactating, with newborn babies, it means you have to have up-to-date data. Then in addition to that, we also need to review the parameters that are in our tool. We have about 50, but then we have to check again if they talk to the needs for the categorical targeting. However, we have to be also mindful, because this one is also a challenge of the nature of this some of these categories. The example I gave of age, it's easier to observe and to capture, but there are other categories that are quite complicated. For example, in the current tool, we have chronic illness in the UBR. My observation has been very difficult to collect data on that. First of all, starting with the enumerator, will have problems communicating, trying to make the respondent understand it, then the respondent will not understand at all. There are issues of disabilities which are very contentious. I think even the definition of disability itself is quite difficult. Clinically, there are also a lot of disagreement what constitutes disabilities, and sometimes it's also according to the context. So those are some of the areas that need to be defined much better if we are moving into categorical targeting. First of all, clarify the parameters that capture the categories within the UBR, identify any additional ones if they are missing, then make sure that at the time of administering the questionnaire, there is more clarity than it is at the moment. Otherwise, in terms of the relevance of the UBR, yes, it's 100% relevant. It captures a lot of categories. And though the UBR has got a wealth classification too, the PMT, which you apply on the households, you can ignore it and just target on the basis of the categories only and ignore the wealth classification. So I believe, yes, the UBR is still relevant, but there's a lot of work that still has to be done to make sure that it's effective in supporting targeting for the categories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalitso. Thanks for that very comprehensive overview. I think that's already clarified some of the basic issues. That fundamentally, the tool, the UBR as a tool, is sound and is adaptable however you wish. And the real questions are around your definition of categories and then the methods for capturing data around those agreed categories. Sabine, from your experience in Cambodia, has this also been a topic for discussion, and has it carried any implications for the way in which, for instance, the online registration system is being used?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much, Dalitso. It was very interesting to listen to you and what Malawi is currently thinking through, because Cambodia is a similar stage. It's a relatively new topic in Cambodia, and we've just started discussions on if and how this could be done. So what I can say here is nothing which is implemented yet. Saying we are discussing, consulting different stakeholders, data users of the ID4 system to reflect, so it reflects more the ideas we currently have. So far, the programs ID4 serves are quite narrowly targeted at the poor. There are now plans to introduce life cycle related social assistance schemes in the upcoming years. It's the so-called family package. And in this context, we also start discussing about categorical targeting. And what we are thinking currently is going into in a phased approach, first to refine what we currently have. So this refers to data quality, to have a look what are the groups already covered by ID4, and is the data quality we have sufficient? If not, do we need to make adaptations to the process itself, to communication activities to better reach out to certain groups? And then also make sure that this disaggregated data on certain categories is readily available and easy accessible to identify ID4 individuals by age, by household type. We're looking, for example, at female-headed households, skipped generational households, and so on. We are also, and this came out from several, Krishna mentioned it, Dalitso, also earlier, integrating systems is very important. Having a lean system, not to duplicate data collection efforts. For example, ID4 is now taking data from the disability database from the Ministry of Social Affairs, so that ID4 does not have to ask the same questions again, but just taking the information which has already been collected from others. Comes with other implementation challenges. Maybe we have more time to discuss about this interoperability issues, a very interesting question as well. And then in the second step, we are looking at enlarging the coverage of ID4 and registering additional non-poor population groups who are vulnerable to poverty. And here we have several options. For example, we are looking at categorical targeting for households who are geographically at risk of natural disasters, which is a very important topic in Cambodia. This would then require a more census-style data collection of households in this high disaster risk areas to capture the data in ID4 ex ante before a shock hits, or maybe have like a post-shock rapid assessment with a different eligibility criteria catalog. So yeah, different options. Then we're also looking households at risk of non-climatic predictable shocks, for example, those in vulnerable employments. We're looking at this big group of near poor. So just adding another category to the ID4 1 and 2, we would have the ID4 3. And ultimately, we are also looking at universal targeting, especially when we're talking about these life cycle related social assistance schemes for children, for elderly, for example. But here we also need to discuss what are the limits of a social registry. And we realize that ID4 is not always the right targeting mechanism. For example, in Cambodia, there's a cash transfer for pregnant women and children under 2. And for ID4, it's very difficult to although it's an on-demand registration system, still it's very hard to keep data on pregnancies because changes happen so quickly that it might be preferred to use, if you have it, a solid civil registration system. Also came out earlier that this is that this link between robust digitized civil registration system and a social registry is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Again, some interesting points there. You mentioned the issue of interoperability, the way in which there's communication between other existing systems, and you've even mentioned where there may be some limitations on the use of the social registry. Krishna, I don't know whether you can speak to some of those issues, particularly on interoperability. We also heard it before about linking into the CRVS and using that as a much more important element of maintaining critical pieces of information of data. So over to you, Krishna, if you could, just a few minutes.
For sure. Yeah, thanks. And I think definitely agreed with what both previous panelists said. I think when it comes to, especially when it comes to, there's obviously sort of broader policy questions with regards to targeting methodologies, and then there's the sort of practical elements of how do we implement this. And I think Dalitso mentioned this really important point of when it comes to these questions, it's almost as if you have to anticipate the consideration of the policy questions even before this policy questions itself, in terms of collecting the data on the appropriate indicators to allow you to think about, is it feasible to switch? Because one of the important elements is, and I think this is why it's important within the UBR, that there are both the indicators for both methodologies in terms of whether one wants to use PMT or whether one wants to use categorical targeting exist. The situation you don't want is when sort of considering these policy questions about which targeting methodology do we need to use, and then realizing that sort of the registry doesn't contain some of the key indicators that you need to use in order to sort of change your methodology. And so I think that piece is really important with regards to sort of identifying what indicators are essential, not just for the methods that are used right now, for the methods that one might consider going forward. And also sort of as those debates and policy questions are being asked, sort of shifting the prioritization appropriately. It's not essential to update every indicator in a registry on a regular basis. And if the targeting methodology changes, that prioritization also changes in terms of what indicators are most important, most dynamic, but also most important with regards to decision-making on targeting. And so that's another piece that we found to be quite important in terms of just the hierarchy of information within your registry as you're sort of changing some of these policy, as you're sort of addressing some of these policy and targeting questions, and ensuring that that's integrated appropriately. To the point of integration, Sabine mentioned it's a sticky and challenging one, particularly with regards to the more technical elements of things in terms of just different data systems fundamentally that are being used for different data sets or for different information. What we found is, I think, and again, the simple iterative approach is really important. Prioritization of there's integrating an overall system, but then there's more iterative methods of sort of taking specific indicators from another data set if need be, and sort of starting by just integrating those specific indicators as long as you have sort of common national ID or a common identifier. And so I think on that front, sort of what we've seen as an approach, you have the big chunky, let's bring all these systems together, which is a long time consuming and sort of resource intensive approach. But even adopting a slightly more iterative, slightly lower tech, what are the most important indicators that we need to pull from this data set? Let's take those one or two out of this data set, as long as we have a sort of something we can match it on and incorporate it into sort of a master data set. Like taking that iterative approach ends up being really important with regards to just almost starting small and then growing from there from an integration perspective. The last piece I'll say on this is more of the practical side, and Dalitso mentioned this as well, with regards to just the change management almost when it comes to adjusting targeting mechanisms, both in terms of communicating that effectively to population, to potential recipients, to ensuring that sort of individuals who might have been eligible before, who are not eligible under new targeting methods, have almost a way to smoothly exit from the system, as well as vice versa. And also sort of considering the budget implications of it as sort of targeting methodologies change and the sort of target base changes. Also ensuring that sort of optimization with regards to the absolute budget that's available when it comes to social transfers, when it comes to sort of the particular program that's being implemented, and setting those criteria accordingly, almost working backwards, even if sort of the policy is changing, ensuring that the criteria are set appropriately, I think is also an important consideration here. So yeah, so a few thoughts from me on both the targeting, the higher level question on sort of shifting targeting approach, but also the practice of how one might want to go about that.
Thanks very much, Krishna. And yeah, thanks. I appreciated also that you raised the issue about the utility, what the information is being used for, particularly the issue of facilitating decision-making. What is that absolute information? You mentioned the hierarchy of information. I found that quite useful as well, to bring in also that there is the techie bit about getting those systems to work, but ultimately it's about people making decisions and having effective access to information upon which sensible decisions can be made. once again, Valentina, you're left with the duty of rounding this all up and trying to kind of capture it nicely for us. But your reward for that is that you can start off our last session, and I'll give that duty to somebody else later on.
Great. Again, I think all of the key points have been made by my fellow panelists. One underlying point here is that social registries, they crystallize those policy and implementation choices, and they're living beasts. They evolve over time, and they need to be responding to however our policy is designed at that moment in time. And in actually a little parenthesis here is that is why it's so important to build in-house capacity and not be handing off their kind of design and delivery kind of solely to external providers who then hand over something as if it were a finished product. They're a completely iterative process, as Krishna has
plug and play.
Yes, definitely not just plug and play. And so I think there's also been a bit of misconception around social registry being equal to poverty targeting, and that's not the case. I mean, obviously this is for understandable and good reasons, because many social registries in many countries were designed as this big pool of socioeconomic data that could be used to inform proxy means tests and other forms of socioeconomic ranking. But this doesn't mean that even when they're designed this way, kind of even when they can be doing poverty targeting, that they can't be also used to inform categorical targeting. And that's what my colleague Dalitso Kalimba was mentioning. So as long as they contain the right data, as long as we design them to also contain that data that can inform categorical targeting, they can be playing both of those functions. And the user programs are the ones who then determine eligibility based on their own criteria. So you might even have in the same country one poverty targeted and one categorically targeted program. They're just using that same database in different ways. And of course, there's cases where you might be designing that social registry to support just categorical targeting, and you're just collecting a lot less data. You don't need all of the socioeconomic, the assets, you might be just focusing on a few key variables. You might be really pushing on the integration with the disability registry, for example, like Sabine was mentioning, to be providing disability benefits. You might be focusing on child benefits. And South Africa's system, for example, has a kind of means tested but kind of categorical system that pens off the SOCPEN database. One thing that we should also say is that the way we register for social registries also depends on these design choices. So think about all of the COVID-19 responses that used these very simple digital registrations through SMS, USSD. They were collecting minimal data for very simple categorical targeting. That very minimal data was then cross-checked against other databases to do some targeting out, affluence testing, kind of removing maybe people who were already receiving benefits, who had a public sector employment, who had kind of big land ownership, for example. Those people were removed and the other people stayed within the system. So the way registration is done, what data we're collecting, it's all linked, and the system ultimately reflects this. So social registries in different countries, they take many different shapes and sizes depending on these choices. And that's what really matters. It's countries thinking through what is it that we need to perform what we want from kind of our policy choices, and making sure that the system reflects that crystallizes that. So ultimately, what the word social registry is this function of supporting registration and determination of eligibility across multiple programs. And they're basically the information system that underlies the single window service approach, whereby people can kind of go and apply in one place, and then that data is used kind of in multiple ways, and they're kind of told, oh, you might be eligible for this, or you might be eligible for that, and maybe they go and update after kind of when their circumstances change. So I think fighting against social registries, or kind of, I think is wrong. What we should all be fighting for is to make social registries more inclusive, making sure that those who are most vulnerable, those who face the highest barriers to access, are actually able to enter these systems and have their data recorded within these systems. We need them to be gender and disability aware, and Sabine's discussion of the linkage with disability registration is really important, but there's many other simple changes. Mr. Dalitso also mentioned just the way the questionnaire is shaped, for example, makes a difference in terms of the risk of excluding people. If you have a filter question saying, is there anyone in the household who's disabled? Many old people who actually have many functional problems would respond, no, they don't consider themselves disabled, but actually they have functional disabilities. So using the Washington set questions might be more appropriate. So small changes can make a big difference. Making sure that social registries are more dynamic, and we've been discussing that, making sure they're accountable, that grievance mechanisms and accountability mechanisms are built in, and you discussed that last time. Being respectful of privacy and protection. Sometimes the risk is we ask loads of questions on everything, so we're covered for the future, but actually there's big data privacy issues there that need combing through, especially if the data is then used for different purposes from what was originally stated, and kind of more generally future-proofing our systems to what our vision is. Even if we might not be providing life cycle grants today, how do we design a system today that it might be able to support that type of program in the future? Over.
Thanks very much, Valentina. Again, a host of very interesting points that you've brought up. Again, reminding us that it is, in the end of the day, a tool that needs to serve whatever our policy decisions are or ambitions for a social protection system. So we need to have some sense of where we're going to be able to determine and understand what kind of tools, registry we require. As you say, future-proofing it to a certain point, but again, behind that is that whole issue of capacity, because I think there are many issues which speak to this issue of capacity in many respects, in many different dimensions that need to be in place. Capacity within specific, to perform specific administrative or technical tasks, but also the issue of communication, the capacity to communicate between different entities that are going to be sharing information and that need to be able to manage that information. What I'd like to do now is move to our third topic, which again is not unrelated to what we've been talking about, but it's brought about, or particularly because of COVID-19 and the extent to which countries have had to be sort of a little bit nimble on their feet to be able to adjust what they're doing to accommodate the needs of new groups of people who have suddenly experienced hardship, vulnerabilities as a result of COVID-19. It's something that's happened that's been certainly the case in Malawi as elsewhere. So the real question is first, what are the key considerations for keeping social registries flexible and adaptable? And what can we learn from the experiences, for instance, of COVID-19, where new programs have very quickly, very rapidly had to be implemented, and the demand on obtaining data has been quite significant. For this conversation, I'd like to again turn to Valentina. This time you can kick us off, maybe with some of the insights that you have garnered from across the globe, and then we'll get some country experiences thereafter. So over to you, Valentina.
Thanks so much. So, I mean, this is a topic that's quite close at heart for me. I've been working on shock responsive and adaptive social protection for quite some time. And before COVID, I'd actually written a piece on this exact topic with my colleague Rodolfo Beasley. And our question was, can we be using routine social protection information systems to respond to shocks? And we did a lot of digging and kind of a lot of interviewing people from across the globe. And what was really interesting is that while, of course, for vertical expansion, so the use of beneficiary data, it was very common to just be using that data, giving more to those same beneficiaries, simple. But for the horizontal expansions to new caseloads, that was actually very rare before COVID-19. It was very rarely done, and for good reasons, kind of understandable reasons, once again. And it comes back to the discussion of social registries taking many shapes and sizes in different countries. It was linked to the coverage of the registries. It was often quite low, and it didn't really feel like it corresponded to the vulnerable or affected population. The relevance of the data, there was a feeling that the data within routine registries wasn't really the right type that would give us an idea of vulnerability and risk, or maybe food security after a crisis, of course. Plus, sometimes it was about very practical data. There wasn't the data to trigger payments, for example. We didn't have, these people weren't enrolled, so we didn't have their bank account details. It was about data currency. We've been discussing that a lot. The data was from before the shock, so why would it be able to give us a sense of who was affected after shock? That's very understandable. It was about accessibility and usability of that data. Kind of, was it in the right hands of the people who actually needed to act upon it? Maybe the humanitarian counterparts in country. It was about data accuracy and trust in that data. It's not just about the objective side, which Krishna was speaking to, of do we have those validation checks? Kind of, is there good processes to validate the data? It's also about how trusted is it by the broader community in the country. And obviously there were issues of protection, security, and data privacy, which are really crucial there. So at the time before COVID, we'd made a whole set of recommendations. If you did want to start thinking about how to use your data for a crisis, you might want to think about certain things. And Sabine mentioned one of those before. For example, increase coverage of your data in areas that are routinely affected by crisis. That's quite an easy one. And there's a broad set of recommendations. I can share the paper. What's really interesting with COVID is that a lot of what we'd seen beforehand was just completely the situation was so grave, so different. So just the number of people affected was so huge that the push to be responding quickly and urgently was so huge that we saw a vast number of countries leverage data from their social registries for the shock response. And that was just because it was a sort of simple, easy way to be reaching non-beneficiary households that broadly were assumed to be in need, especially where there was a ranking in place. You could just kind of go all the way up the ranking and include those people in your response. That was done, kind of examples include Peru, Colombia, Pakistan, Brazil, Chile, Indonesia, Congo, Ghana. The list is long. What's interesting is that almost none of these countries only use their social registry. They use it as a first layer in their response, acknowledging all the limitations we've been talking about. There's no way that existing data could be reflecting the vulnerability status of informal workers, for example. There was no way that it had the right coverage, for example, in urban areas. Very often social registries have a skew towards rural areas. So they acknowledged all the limitations, they used it as a first step, and then they used other data collection approaches as a second step. And what's fundamental here to think about is that actually very often the fact that they could have a second option was because of the capacity that had been generated through the process of building a social registry and related information systems, and through the information system itself. So even the countries that, for example, drew data to do affluence testing through interoperability, they'd built the capacity to do that because of having run a social registry information system for many years and kind of been working through data to be kind of informing program eligibility. So that capacity building over time is really important. So my message here would be that I wouldn't develop a social registry for shock response. I think that's stupid. But if you are investing, if you are kind of working off an information system and building that over time, there's many small tweaks and changes that you can be doing to increase its shock responsiveness. And I think you should be considering those. And I can share some resources on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I think indeed it might be useful to have some of those references so that people can also read some of these broader experiences. Okay, let's just turn, I'm just a little bit mindful of time, and I know I'm going to be in trouble later because the window of opportunity for answering questions is fast closing, but I think participants will be very much engaged as we are in this conversation. And even if we don't have the chance for a formal Q&A, they will have appreciated having had an opportunity to listen to the panelists. So let's just, I really would like this conversation to continue as long as it needs to continue, and to ensure that everybody has a chance to speak. Let's just see afterwards how we do. By the way, we have about 125 people joining us, which is very gratifying, and we hope that that number continues to stay right until the end. Sabine, we don't necessarily have to make social registries designed for shock responsive, to accommodate shock responsive approaches, but what was the experience? Has there been an experience? How did this on-demand system work? Did it give any some kind of head start in terms of being able to respond in Cambodia?
Yes, it definitely did. And as was said before, and in the beginning, Valentina mentioned already that this dynamic inclusion principle of an on-demand approach is particularly important when you develop an adaptive social protection system, and with the capability of responding to a crisis. And this on-demand registration done by IDPO has been used as the mechanism to identify people affected by the COVID-19 crisis and the economic consequences in Cambodia. So yes, we made good experience, but I fully agree with all the points and the limitations Valentina just made. And my main point is that we realized the scoring mechanism we are using is more appropriate for chronic poverty, and it's not very sensitive to shocks, because the questionnaire and the scoring is not designed to be very sensitive to rapid changes in the financial security of a household. It's more to identify structural poverty, and it was doing this pretty well, I think. In the past, this was sufficient, but of course, if you are talking about shock responsiveness, then you would need to think about other criteria, and you need to think about it before the crisis hits, especially for climate-related shocks, and Cambodia is very vulnerable to that. And I talked about this earlier when on the second topic. What I would also like to mention is, I think what is very important is a better coordination between disaster management and social protection. Because very often these two systems, they still work in silos. And talking again about Cambodia, the past experience have shown that the social protection system has the great potential to meet those who are affected of shocks if the coordination is being improved. Cambodia is currently developing a strategy on shock responsive social protection. It's not yet validated, but there's a lot of thinking about how we can develop a joint strategy, better coordination structures, and also to better define the roles and responsibilities of the two sectors. And one example how we are already doing this with IDPO is the linkage to an early warning system, which is implemented by the World Food Programme together with the National Committee for Disaster Management. And it's an early warning system, and it's linked. There's an API between the IDPO system and this platform for risk and vulnerability assessment. So that it's very easy for data users to see where are the households, the poor households affected by a flood or by a drought. So I think that's a very promising example we're currently working on, and I think in a couple of weeks we will also see this reflected on the web portal, and so that data users can themselves then see who's affected and how to better reach out to them.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And I think it's quite appropriate that we now return to Malawi and allow Dalitso to give us some insights into the experiences there, because I think Malawi may be a few steps ahead. Already in the context of COVID, there was a particular initiative response set up to address the needs in urban areas where the social cash transfer program hadn't been operating. And that was specifically in the context of COVID-19. But there's also now increasing experience with providing predictable lean season support to social cash transfer and public works beneficiaries using the UBR as an instrument for the identification of households. But I think that Dalitso is much better placed to perhaps highlight some of the key experiences there.
Yeah, thank you. I think we indeed have had interesting experiences, especially with the the urban intervention, the COVID urban cash intervention. I think some of the issues that we experienced on the ground are those that have already been highlighted by colleagues, Valentina. There was really a lot to learn in the course of implementation, and especially for the urban cash intervention, so that we're learning by doing. First of all, let me indicate that our UBR coverage at the time we had the COVID, it did not cover the cities. So this intervention was for the cities which were not covered by the UBR. So already we see the importance of making sure that the social registry has full coverage so that we don't struggle when a shock happens in terms of the targeting. So we really struggled because we had to collect fresh data from the households. And the second challenge is that we're in the midst of COVID. We did not want to expose our enumerators. So even the data collection itself had to be done within a very short period of time, and the interviews had to also be short. So that meant that we had a few questions on the questionnaire. The advantage we had was that in terms of targeting for the urban cash intervention, it was primarily geographical. Poverty, yes, was a consideration, but for entire locations, which we called poverty hotspots. So the task we had was just to identify the poverty hotspots within the city, which are basically the slums. And then the idea was to target everybody, to get everybody there registered. And ideally would have actually enrolled everybody within those locations. But we still had to make sure that we do not enroll outliers, because even with the slums, there were some households that are really clearly much better off. So the task of selecting households was not very complicated, because what we're doing was basically to eliminate the outliers. So there wasn't really much focus in trying to get the poorest, because we're basically focusing on making sure that those are clearly well-to-do should not be enrolled on the program. So that aspect was a bit comforting. And then I think at implementation, the usual challenges, for the first time, we were trying to pay households using electronic means, specifically it was mobile money. And we encountered a whole lot of challenges, like we needed to, the households needed to comply to the know your customer requirements. And what happened was that the numbers that they were using for the mobile wallet, for most of them, could not match with the national IDs. So for that reason, we're able to reach out to a lot of households that are really qualified, were enrolled on the program, but do not make any payment. So those were lessons in terms of the actual implementation. So we now have data within our UBR for the major cities, taking advantage of our experience on COVID, but then we do not capture the entire cities, because the focus in terms of the data collection was just the hotspots. So it's another area where we need to ensure that we collect data for the rest of the cities. For the traditional lean season response, the one that is more predictable, yes, it's quite much easier to implement because we have the ones that are already on the social cash transfer, and we undertake vertical expansion. It's easier because those are within the management information system for the program. For the horizontal information, for the horizontal expansion, then we are using the social registry to expand. Our experience has been, yes, we have been able to get data from the UBR to identify the beneficiaries for the HE. But the challenge that we have had is that the process of identifying the beneficiaries involves an aspect of validation by the communities. Now, what we have noted is in most of the districts where we have the lean season response, there is a culture of not publicly indicating when we have a community meeting, somebody cannot indicate that that household is not poor as it is claiming. That does not happen, unfortunately. So the validation process doesn't work in terms of really validating the information that we're getting from the poverty classification using the PMT. That is a challenge. The other challenge so there's an issue of disputing the rankings, but after the meetings have already ended. That's the challenge. We have to address some of the issues as case management during implementation, but ideally we're not supposed to be doing that. We're supposed to have already addressed them at the point of data collection. Maybe the other challenge we have is to do with the, not necessarily to do with the issues of the social registry, but due to the fact that one, when you're undertaking data collection, there's already an expectation that there will be benefits coming with this. So the data that is collected, usually in district where we are undertaking this response, to a certain extent is compromised by that aspect, because households preposition themselves to be poor. They would rather be captured as poor than better off. That is a challenge on its own. Then lastly, we have the issue of the numbers that are allocated to the maybe traditional authorities where you have to respond. There's always pressure to get more numbers participating in the response. And that sometimes also creates problems in terms of agreeing in terms of who needs to go into the program and who needs to be excluded. I think briefly, those are some of our experiences with regard to both the COVID response, which was one-off, and then the predictable lean season response, which we almost implement almost every year. Thank you.
Dalitso, thank you very much indeed for those examples and for also bringing forward the sort of socio-cultural dimensions that one needs to encounter and negotiate. And of course, in a situation of emergency or where you want to have rapid response and deployment, the time to negotiate and maneuver and resolve those issues is usually much shorter. So I can imagine that adds another layer of complexity in ensuring that you have the right people identified. I think if I recall from our discussion on GRMs, where we had the Kuchi example, we also learned that there are quite a number of complaints submitted, lodged by people who felt for one reason or another that they should have been included and were not. And again, I think that speaks to the issue of communication and clarity of communication and the timeliness of communication, so that people fully understand what a program is, the parameters of a program. And of course, this relates to the issue where you say people will, in a way, anticipate what a program might bring and prepare themselves, preposition themselves to ensure that they're included. So thank you very much, Dalitso. I'd like to now give the opportunity to Krishna to round off this discussion, maybe to reflect on some of the things that he has heard, or to bring in additional points related to some of the technical issues related to adapting social registries in a sort of emergency context. So Krishna, the floor is yours to round this last part of our conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tony. And I'll try round as quickly as possible in the interest of questions. I think, I mean, a couple of big takeaways from that discussion. And I think sort of one overarching theme of, unsurprisingly, one thing doesn't solve everything, in the sense of, I think, sort of the social registries, the way in which they plug into, especially when it comes to shock response and the need for sort of both diverse sort of sources of information, but then also, as Dalitso just mentioned, a much more nuanced understanding of sort of how that information is collected, because time is much shorter than it normally would be if one was sort of looking to implement a more detailed and sophisticated program. So I think that for me is one, it's been a theme throughout the conversation, but it's also, I think, one big takeaway within shock response in particular, that as much as COVID is unanticipated, there's will only become more prominent both while the pandemic is still going on, but then also sort of going forward. I think a couple quick points I'll mention in terms of the more, I think this is also when it comes to shock response, time when, or a place when technology is a lot more impactful, both in terms of sort of faster responses, as well as in terms of enabling additional sources of information when it comes to aspects of targeting. So quickly, I'll talk about a couple of things that we've been thinking about and working on during COVID at ID Insight, just within the same sort of theme of how do you quickly obtain information and obtain it in a way that is sensitive to the pandemic. One of the sort of innovations that we were rolling out during COVID was primarily in India, and aptly named to the theme of this conversation, we call it data on demand. And the entire idea of data on demand was building out a network that allows you to obtain data much faster and much cheaper than alternative methods of data collection that might be more conventional. And so when it came to COVID-19, the team, because of the network that was already built out in India, was able to collect evidence representative of about 80 million of India's most vulnerable residents in 2 weeks in order to inform sort of government's COVID-19 response strategy around economic relief and behavior change communication. And so that's something that we're sort of, it's scaled across India at the moment, and we're planning to sort of scale it into a few countries on the continent in Africa. But one of the things that really sort of allowed it required a sort of upfront investments within infrastructure, but really was a tech-enabled solution that allowed us to obtain sort of ancillary data from a large population in a much shorter period of time than might be sort of otherwise possible, particularly to inform policymaking. The other piece that we've seen is quite prominent and we're still working on a lot is the use of sort of more sophisticated data science methodologies, particularly when it comes to predicting shocks. And so both when it comes to sort of using satellite data and geospatial data, when it comes to predicting shocks, when some of the work that we're doing now is in the space of agriculture, or when it comes to sort of using these methods to more effectively target transfers. That's another area where we've seen sort of an openness, or more advanced abilities have allowed us to access a lot more information than might otherwise exist, and information that doesn't require going out and collecting it, where a sort of upfront investment has facilitated being a lot more proactive when it comes to what the responses are going to be. So I'll stop it there to leave a little bit of time for questions. But those are things that I think on our side are very front of mind with regards to just shock responsive methods that are sort of different to what we might consider on a sort of regular basis.
Great, Krishna, thanks for being so succinct. That was very useful. I'm sure people have noted the points you've made. In fact, I'm very relieved to find out, I was just looking at the chat and the Q&A, that in fact, 7 of the 9 questions that had been posed have been asked by the panelists in between. So that's fantastic. So a good word of thanks to all of you for having found the ways and means to respond that way. I'm sure that will be appreciated by those who posted the questions. I also know we've had a couple of questions that were posted via the chat. We haven't been able to sort of log those, but we will see if we can at all get back to those of you who did post on the chat rather than the Q&A. We will see if we can organize a response. Given how short the time is now, and I know that some of the panelists have to leave, I'd like to just first of all really express my gratitude to all the panelists for a very, very engaging conversation. I found it extremely interesting, and I learned a lot. I hope those of you in the audience also feel the same. So a big vote of thanks to all of you, absolutely brilliant. Certainly exceeded my expectations. But let me now just hand over to Patricia to give us some closing remarks so that we can actually close at past. So Patricia, you've heard from everybody. The floor is yours just to maybe bring closure to this webinar.
I thank you very much, Tony. And at this moment, I would like to say, first of all, thank you so much to all the panelists. The experiences, the lessons you have shared were quite interesting, thought-provoking, and they were also very insightful. And I'm sure that even our audience who are with us this afternoon have picked something that is of interest to each one of us, which I think we will be able to reflect on and see how we apply those lessons and experiences in our own various activities and programs. I would want to say that the discussion has given us an opportunity to go back and look at how we are managing our various social registries, where we think we need to make changes, and also maybe where we need to refine in terms of the systems and so on. The number of issues have been presented, and just to mention a few, I think some of the things that I picked, some of the important lessons from the presentations are issues to do with the systems that we set up with regard to the social registries. How robust are those systems? Institutionalization of methodologies. There was also issues to do with making the registries more inclusive instead of maybe narrowing them down. There were issues on demand systems, and also the more interesting issue on can we make social registries to be shock sensitive? The drastic one was to say we can't make them shock sensitive. So it's like we have to use different approaches depending on what the situation is at hand. But otherwise, I would want to say that I personally have also benefited from the experiences that have been shared. And I would like to thank all the participants, those who were able to join us in this webinar. Thank you for your interest. I think in the chat, there were also resources that were shared by the panelists. We may also wish to take advantage of those. Otherwise, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Tony, and thank you all, and bye. Thank you.